Julian Jackson raised briefly the unpromising subject of de Gaulle and jokes and said that there were some good ones. And this can be a problem with Mrs. Thatcher, who's not known for her jokes. But being the fourth person in this panel, I will just tell you one thing she said, which was certainly witty. She attended a dinner where men kept congratulating one another in their speeches. And when it finally came to her, she was very fed up. And she said, I've just listened to 7 speeches by men, and all I want to say is that the cocks may crow, but the hen lays the eggs. And that, I think, was her very much expressing her character and her unique position. And I'm sorry I have no illustrations today, but I'm pleased to have this instead, because when I look at this remarkable creature, I think she's quite expressive of the way Margaret Thatcher, the impact Margaret Thatcher has had as the first woman leader in British society, and how much she loved being at the prow of the ship of state. And there's something about this posture which reminds me, though Mrs. Thatcher was always more fully clad than that. I'm not going to talk about Mrs. Thatcher in every respect. I'm going to concentrate on her in the Cold War, but I think that tells you a lot about her in general. And I want to go back to when she first became Conservative leader in 1975. And on this issue, as with economic issues and many issues, she wished to make a break with the past. And the fashion then was for détente. And she thought that the West was doing it from a position of weakness, and she was very worried about what was then called Finlandization. That's to say, the idea that Finland didn't dare do anything in order to survive, to ward off Soviet attack, and this would be a phenomenon that would spread throughout the West. And she immediately tackled this. She wanted to tackle the issue both in terms of great power relationships and defense relationships, and on a sort of moral plane. So she said this in her first major speech on the subject. When the Soviet leaders jail a writer or a priest or a doctor or a worker for the crime of speaking freely, it's not only for humanitarian reasons that we should be concerned. For these acts reveal a regime that is afraid of truth and liberty. It dare not allow its people to enjoy the freedom we take for granted. And a nation that denies those freedoms to its own people will have few scruples in denying them to others. So she saw it very much always in terms of trying to reach the people oppressed by the Soviet Union, as well as the more traditional interpower relationships, which she was also very interested in. And she shared a view with a man called Ronald Reagan, who she met for the first time in that year, and who at that time held no office, that the Soviets, in her phrase, and in her next big speech on this, are bent on world domination. And when she made her second speech, this absolutely enraged the Soviets. And Red Star, the newspaper of the Red Army, attacked her, and they satirized her, and they said, she's the Iron Lady. And they meant this as an insult, because how sarcastic, as Russian propaganda often is, and sexist. So she couldn't be an Iron Lady because she's a lady. It's just really comical to be an Iron Lady. You can be an Iron Chancellor like Bismarck, that was the comparison they made, but not an Iron Lady. Mrs. Thatcher, and this was part of almost a breakthrough for her leadership, immediately seized on this. She could see exactly how this would help. And so she had a special dinner speech at her constituency association where she wore red, which she very rarely did, because red is the colour of socialism, so she normally wore blue. It's different in the United States. And she said, I stand before you tonight in my Red Star chiffon evening gown. You should watch it on YouTube, it's good. My face softly made up and my fair hair gently waved, the Iron Lady of the Western world, a Cold War warrior. Yes, I am an Iron Lady. After all, it wasn't a bad thing to be an Iron Duke. She's talking about the Duke of Wellington there. Yes, if that's how they wish to interpret my defensive values and freedoms fundamental to our way of life. So she stole from her opponents the best sobriquet she could possibly have to make herself known across the world, and of course one which dramatized not only her views and strength of character, but her sex. Very, very important always in the way she approached the issue. Then, of course, she won the election in 1979, and in 1980, early in 1981, Ronald Reagan became the President of the United States. And between the two of them, they were arguing to confront the Soviet menace in terms of the balance of nuclear power. And they succeeded between them in and actually, as mentioned, helped by Helmut Kohl, in the installation of cruise and Pershing missiles in Europe and the defeat of CND and all of that. She won the Falklands War in 1982, which impressed the Soviets mightily as a sense that the British actually perhaps could do something military. And of course, she won the 1983 general election, partly fought on this issue, with the biggest majority that any Conservative government has ever got in the era of universal suffrage. Right, so that's the first 4 years of office. And then she realized that because she had achieved these things with Reagan, that it was time to bargain from strength. Because she was not ideological, though she also was realistic. And she loved to say she was a conviction politician, but actually she also was cunning, and that she would never love to say, but it was true. And she knew that this was the time to have dialogue, but the question was, with whom? And she went to the funeral of Yuri Andropov in February 1984 in Moscow and despaired because all these Soviet leaders hanging around mourning the great man were all very, very old, including his successor. And on the plane back, she sat down with a sort of sank into her seat and she said, "For God's sake, find me a young Russian." And the Foreign Office, which was not her favorite institution, actually did oblige, and they came up with Mikhail Gorbachev, who, remember, was not at that time the Soviet leader. He was likely to become the next Soviet leader, but he was not the Soviet leader. And she invited him to Chequers, her country residence, and there took place this extraordinary debate. Her press secretary told me that the very first thing she said to Gorbachev as she took him into the room was, I want you to know that I hate communism. And it was this was the sort of tone of the whole thing. And the extraordinary thing was that it was successful. And the reason for this was that they both liked the frankness, and they were talking rather like students, debating. When we're young, we tend to do that. And she was saying capitalism and liberty is so great and free markets are great. And Gorbachev was saying, no, that's cruel, it's beastly, everyone lives joyfully. He used the word joyfully in the Soviet Union. And she immediately took to him. It's always important in Mrs. Thatcher's relationships with world leaders, who were all virtually all men, as to whether she sort of, almost you could say, fancied them. Whether she thought they were manly men. And she thought this very much of Reagan, and she thought it very much of Gorbachev, who, in her words, had wonderful sparkly eyes. And a trust, even in this, the time taken for this meeting was supposed to be 3 hours. It took 6 or 7. Talks, lunch, more talks. And she immediately came out and said the famous words, "This is a man we can do business with." And she then flew, the most extraordinary week in her life. As Gorbachev left, she said, "Oh, tomorrow's China, and I haven't had my hair done." And she rushed out to get it done. And she then flew to China to talk about the Anglo-Hong Kong agreement to Hong Kong, to talk to the Hong Kong people about that, and then to Camp David to talk to Reagan about many things, including trying to persuade him of the importance of Gorbachev. And when Gorbachev came to office in that year, he quickly saw, to use the words of one of his aides, he quickly saw Mrs. Thatcher as the shortest way to send a message to Washington. And this did establish a remarkable relationship with trust. Very deep trust with Reagan, though by no means always agreement. And actually quite a level of trust with the Kremlin. And this developed, and perestroika got going, and everyone got interested in Gorbachev. And perhaps the apex of it for her, as well as her great visit to Poland in 1988, was her visit to Moscow in 1987. Some of you will remember or have seen pictures of her with her fur hat and her camel hair coat in the snow and all this sort of thing. And it suited Gorbachev's turn to give her great freedom, which she'd never done before to a visiting Western leader. So she was allowed to move around the streets, meet people, and above all to be interviewed on Soviet television, where she completely wiped the floor with the two sort of apparatchik-type interviewers who were rude. And the Soviet people absolutely adored it, because they had never seen anything remotely like it. And the interesting thing is that she did it by attacking the regime with which she was trying to establish better relations. She didn't mince her words. And in these endless talks she had with Gorbachev, because they continued to argue at night, he moved rooms. I think he'd done this deliberately. And he said, look at this painting. It was a painting of a rural scene after a storm with the sun now shining and everything a bit wet. And he said, Prime Minister, this is like our conversation with the light. And she looked, and of course she couldn't prepare this, and she said, yes, Mr. President, but the light is coming from the west. Which was smart. And so I think it is not an exaggeration to say that in this middle period from 83 to 88, I would say, basically which coincided with Reagan, and this was the double act was so powerful, she really was very, very important in changing the whole world situation and the Cold War. But then comes this very curious and difficult period for her, where she gets what she wants, but also what she doesn't want, as is often the way in the high politics and world affairs. And so the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and Mrs. Thatcher actually privately described it almost that day, I think, as a dagger in my heart. Because though she had called for, and she, in a way, very much, totally wanted the fall of the wall, she was very, very frightened of German reunification. And there were basically two reasons for this. One, I think, much exaggerated by her, and one more powerful. She thought that German nationalism would return. This was a serious fear of hers, and it was obviously a fear worth having, but I think it was exaggerated in her mind. But she also feared that if this happened, the Soviet Union and Gorbachev, whom she now had a close relationship with, would not be able to contain it. And there would be a conflagration, there would be war, there would be collapse. And what you might end up with is a neutral, united Germany, neutral in between Russia and the West, and therefore very dangerous for us. And you might also have a revanchist old Soviet or Russian movement, which in fact, of course, did nearly happen with a coup against Gorbachev the year after Mrs. Thatcher left office. So her fears were not unreasonable. And she also had this great issue of the nationalities, which started to come through, which, of course, we all now live with and had been suppressed under the Soviet Union. And she was very conflicted on this because she greatly believed in the liberation of, relatively easy, the liberation of Poland, Hungary, etc., once the Cold War ended, but also the Baltic states and Ukraine and so on. But she was very, very worried by how that might play out in terms of violence, collapse, etc. So she went, in June 1990, she went to speak to the parliament in Kiev, and she was given a rapturous reception. But she didn't actually say to them what they wanted. She didn't say, yes, go off and be independent. She said, please give Gorbachev more time, try to support his reforms, it's worth it, etc., etc. And so she, at the very end, what ought to have been the sort of apotheosis of her Cold War policy, I mean, she remained incredibly popular in the east of Europe, but she was actually frozen out towards the end by President Bush, with whom she didn't have such a good relationship as with Reagan, and by Helmut Kohl. And you could say that the sort of hinge, she got sort of caught by the hinge of history. So how does all that look now? Or rather, what might it tell us about where we are now? I think one of the things that Margaret Thatcher was very good at always, though she often preached optimism, she always retained a sense of threat. She always understood that institutions and freedom, free markets, liberty, were threatened by people who didn't like them for one reason or another. And this was the key reason, of course, for a high level of defense. And she got a very good memo from Charles Pole, her beloved private secretary, at the height of all this, when everyone was talking about the end of history. He said to her that no, the 90s and beyond will mark, this is in January 1990, will mark the return of history, and the West will once again be confronting nationalism. And I think that what we can see, what happened with the West in the years that ensued after her fall and with the rise of Putin, was that we did get pretty sleepy about all of this. We did sort of think, if you do think the history's ended, you will become negligent. And she was right. It doesn't end. It didn't end. And so, as was mentioned earlier, speaking about Adenauer and Merkel, not Adenauer, that the vulnerability on the energy front that you see under Angela Merkel has caused real trouble now in the Putin era. And of course, what we also discover about Russia is that the imperial desire, though it's no longer expressed in communist terms, is actually the doctrine of Putin. That's what his famous essay says. So, and And it's only really on the February the 24th last year that we began to wake up to all of this. Thank you.
Do you read my body language?
I do, yes, unavoidably. I think what we now find is, in a way, what Mrs. Thatcher always hoped for, which is a Europe that is becoming active in defending its freedom. And that Europe is the sort of Europe she preferred to the tight Western European Union of old. The dynamism is coming from the Atlantic and from the east of that Europe, from the countries that are actually directly threatened by Putin. So now, just to end by going back to the beginning, the word Finlandization is reversing its meaning. It now stands for what's being strong in the West. And I hope very much that, I hope I'm the first person to suggest this, that we'll soon have the word Swedenization for the same reason. Thank you.
Thank you. Charles.
Sorry.
To go back to the start, what can be said about the Iron Lady and feminism, or at least about the Iron Lady and other women in politics?
Well, Mrs. Thatcher always said she wasn't a feminist. And she was very keen to be Mrs. Thatcher. Nowadays, if she was a politician, she would be Ms. Roberts, wouldn't she, which is her maiden name. And she adopted all the characteristic things of traditional patriarchal relationships and so on. But the thing is, she didn't believe in the equality of the sexes. She believed in the superiority of women. And the way to deal with this was to pretend that you accepted all the male conventions and then screw them. I mean, and that's how it worked. And when I was talking about this earlier, when I was trying to imagine myself in her shoes, suppose I'd been Prime Minister and I had been the only man in a cabinet of 20 women, how would I have behaved? I think I would have found it very exciting. I really would have wanted to impress them and persuade them and all the rest of it. And that's how she felt the other way around. She loved being not only the woman, but the only woman among all those men. And they jolly well had to listen to her. And that was just a constant thrill for her for an unprecedentedly long time.